Well, I have the great honor to introduce the set of speakers on the environmental movement. And I'm Ann Lage. I'm a longtime staff member and interviewer at the Regional Oral History Office, where one of my main areas of concern has been documenting the environmental movement. Each of these three people that we're going to look at and hear from today are either activists or historians of the movement, and I think you're going to get some very interesting points of view. I think the reason we're here as representing the environmental movement is because the strength of the collection in the Bancroft is really amazing, and you'll learn that as our speakers go on too. The Bancroft holds the papers of so many environmental movements. Just look under SAVE in Pathfinder. Save the Bay, Save the Redwoods, Save the Coast, Save the River. They're all here in the Bancroft Library, as well as the Sierra Club and many other organizations, large and small, old and new. And then there are the personal papers of environmentalists, from the David Brower papers, which are a hugely extensive collection that have just been cataloged and ordered. Edgar Wayburn, Robert Marshall, many unknown names that it came in, a lot of them came into the collection through the Sierra Club members' papers. And it's a rich, rich area for researchers. At Rojo, we also have a very strong environmental emphasis. One of the very first interviews we did was with Will Colby, who was sort of John Muir's henchman in the fighting, saving Hetch Hetchy, the failed effort to save Hetch Hetchy. And then he went on to become secretary of the Sierra Club, and we interviewed him, I think, in 1959. That was probably our first environmental interview, and we must have at least 250 or more by now. Most recently with two figures in California from the 1990s. They served in the Pete Wilson administration, Doug Wheeler and Richard Wilson. So it's quite an area for research. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sylvia McLaughlin. I always feel that it's redundant to introduce Sylvia McLaughlin, especially at Berkeley, where she just pops up everywhere and everybody knows her. She's always wearing red, which is very cheerful. But Sylvia, most of you know, was a co-founder of Save San Francisco Bay Association. Now it's called Save the Bay. And she, not just a co-founder, but a long-time sustainer of that organization, even today. Another persistent interest of hers is the East Shore Park. She's a member of Citizens for East Shore Park, and she is, I think it casts fear into the hearts of every developer who has their eyes on some of that East Shore real estate. They quake when Sylvia comes in because she's persistent and she's diplomatic and tough, and we love her. We're hoping, we have one oral history with Sylvia. It's a joint oral history with Sylvia and the two other co-founders of Save the Bay, Esther Gulick and Kay Kerr. But we're working hard now to get funded a full biographical oral history with Sylvia McLaughlin to really get something of the character of this woman who's done so very much. And I also want to announce at this occasion, I think this is a surprise for Sylvia as well, that the Bancroft has been successful in securing funding to process the Save the Bay papers, a big collection that it's been accessible, but not nearly as accessible as it's going to be now when it gets fully processed. And that is a gift from the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation of Los Angeles, of all places. But after all, Save the Bay has taught a lot of other organizations how to do it. Sylvia McLaughlin.
Thank you very much, Ann. I am just delighted to be here, and Save the Bay is so grateful to the Bancroft for taking all their papers, and now it's pretty exciting that we have funding. And I am personally very grateful that they're willing to take my 40 years worth of boxes that I'm still struggling with. I plan to give the first 10 minutes that I have to excerpts of a documentary film on saving the Bay. And Ron Blattman, the director, is here, and we'll be glad to talk with any of you afterwards. So here we go.
San Francisco Bay, one of the Earth's great estuaries, one of the finest natural harbors in the world.
San Francisco Bay is obviously the most beautiful natural bay in North America. There's nothing that has its scope, its beauty, and its setting.
In 1961, California is about to become America's most populous state. While new modern cities blossom all around the San Francisco Bay Area, the bay itself is a fetid waste.
The bay was basically a cesspool. Raw sewage was being pumped into the bay. There was no sewage treatment. The shoreline was ringed with dumps, both actual official dumps that each city had and unofficial dumps at the end of each road where people would back the station wagon up and throw in the lawn chairs.
And I remember my almost mother-in-law saying, well, it's a good thing they're filling in the bay because it stinks so bad.
In a little over a century, 1/3 of San Francisco Bay is filled. 90% of its historical tidal marshes, the great mixing zones where life thrives, are gone. And plans are afoot to fill more.
Massive suburbanization, landfills, bay filling to put houses, to put garbage dumps, to put office buildings, bridges crisscrossing, bringing freeways, the freeway network spreading around the bay to spread suburbia.
In 1959, the United States Army Corps of Engineers publishes a straightforward administrative report forecasting developments to the year 2020.
Saying that 70% of San Francisco Bay was shallow enough to be filled.
If people could dredge up all the development plans for filling the bay, it would look like a river.
By the second decade of the new millennium, the report predicts, the San Francisco Bay Area will be home to more than 10 million people, and San Francisco Bay itself, until now the nation's second largest estuary, will be all but gone.
Absolutely nobody was looking at the bay as a whole bay, and each private owner, each city, each county was proceeding under the pressures of population growth and demand for flat land. Virtually everybody was sort of on a bender of let's see if we can fill our part and we'll have more land for taxable development.
Didn't it happen? What stopped the seemingly irresistible force of urban growth? What spared San Francisco Bay? This is the story of saving the Bay, a story of human impacts catastrophic and miraculous, a story of an estuary nearly destroyed, only to live again.
When I look out and see the bay, I'm just so grateful that it's still there.
For the first time on television, Saving the Bay traces the dramatic historical arc of land and water use in one of the great estuaries of the world.
The bay is the central metaphor, the central narrative theme of the San Francisco Bay Area. You can't think of the development of this region without contemplating the bay.
Produced in high-definition television and using state-of-the-art animation to recreate a world that was. Saving the Bay tells the story of the San Francisco estuary in 4 one-hour episodes. Episode 1, marvel of nature, begins with the origins of the bay at the end of the last ice age.
It was a place of tremendous fecundity.
From the first people to inhabit its abundant shores, to Spanish missionaries and soldiers.
I think they were surprised by the numbers of indigenous peoples that they encountered.
From Russian and American fur traders to scientists glimpsing an unexplored world for the first time.
And it was just a land of wonders and curiosities, of redwoods, of big mountains, of grizzly bears, of whales, of huge things, of prodigious things.
Marvel of nature discovers a land of wonders, changed forever. Episode 2, Harbor of Harbors, chronicles the sudden rise of San Francisco Bay onto the world scene.
Bang. As Kerry McWilliams famously said, in California, the lights came on all at once.
In a little over a year, a sleepy backwater, Yerba Buena, is transformed into an instant metropolis, San Francisco.
The haste meant enormous waste and enormous destruction.
It is the story of the rise of the industrial and agricultural empire in the West, of a once massive bay fishery, and its ultimate demise, of the rise of the conservation movement in America, and how everything changed one fateful morning. Episode 3, Miracle Workers, enters an age of engineering wonders from 1906 to 1960.
The finishing of California, the mending of California, the reassembly of California through engineering is going to be the great work, literally, of the 20th century.
Entire rivers are rerouted and a vast watershed re-engineered.
Water going out the Golden Gate was wasted water.
It is the story of the conquest of the automobile, the decline of the largest ferry fleet in the nation, and the triumph of bridging the bay.
They were engineering marvels, and they were engineering miracles, particularly the Golden Gate Bridge, which was practically built on the ocean, literally, on the floor of the ocean itself.
It is a story of American industry, common women and men coming together in the nation's hour of need, and the juggernaut of growth in the aftermath that transforms a place called the Valley of Heart's Delight into Silicon Valley.
When books are written about sprawl, they use San Jose as the example.
Episode 4, Save the Bay, chronicles the period from 1960 to the present and beyond.
So we could see the trucks going down to the bay, filling it on a daily, hourly basis.
It is a time when progress calls into question the bay's very existence, until a band of women join forces to save the bay.
These 3 women raise the awareness of everybody in the world about the value of this estuary.
A time when a grassroots uprising transforms the conservation movement into mass environmentalism.
This was a direct frontal assault on God-given rights of Americans and American institutions to do whatever they wanted with the land.
And sets a new standard for coastal management around the world.
It is, I believe, a milestone in our continuing efforts to preserve the quality of life, not only for this generation, but also for those who will follow us.
We love the Bay Area, and so this is a great way to clean up the Bay Area and save the Bay and make it a healthy place for animals and children.
Saving the Bay is a story of our own time and a story of days to come.
The technology of satellite imaging, of very fast computers that can roll the landscape forward through geologic time, this understanding and the tools to envision the future beg us to take a look at what the future will be.
From executive producer Ron Blattman and KTEH, Silicon Valley Public Television, the station that brought you Cadillac Desert, comes a new story of people and an environment.
Go down to the edges of the bay. Look at how beautiful it is. Feel the breezes at nightfall. Look at the wonderful wildlife that lives there.
A groundbreaking environmental history for public television.
I think saving and preserving a great bay like San Francisco Bay is a great task for the future.
The story of San Francisco Bay.
I just hope that those that follow will share the same awareness of the Bay so that they too will be able to continue the process of saving the Bay. I hardly feel like I need to say anything after that. However, in my allotted 8 minutes, I'll try to mention the highlights of why we started and how we happen to be mostly successful. I'll limit my remarks to California, since to go global would take a little longer. As with many important movements in the 60s, as you've heard earlier, Save the Bay's origins were in Berkeley. Doubtless many of you know that in 1960, Kaker, Esther Gillick, and I were galvanized into action by the city of Berkeley's plan to fill 2,000 acres of open water, and by a report of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers saying that 70% of the bay was shallow enough to be filled, leaving only a river-like, deep-water shipping channel. We were appalled that the filling of this beautiful national natural resource was unconsidered progress. Also at that time, public access to the bay's shoreline was measured in feet rather than in miles. For the record, Save San Francisco Bay Association, more commonly known as Save the Bay, was organized in 1961. In November 1963, we were fortunate to have been able to persuade the Berkeley City Council that a drastically reduced bay fill plan that promoted public access and recreational open space was both aesthetically and economically a better way to go. Next, since Berkeley's was only one of 30-some extensive bay fill plans all around the bay, it seemed obvious that state legislation was the only way to save the entire bay from further shrinking. With the assistance of San Francisco's Senator Gene McClure and our then Assemblyman Nick Petras, a study commission was established. In 1965, on its recommendation, the Bay Conservation and Development Act was passed. 2 years later, a hard-fought campaign ensued to make BCDC permanent. In this all-out effort, we had wonderful help from many volunteer citizen activists. Busloads of Save the Bay members went to Sacramento committee hearings, and legislators received cartons of mail and numerous phone calls. This is before email and before cell phones and all those things. Fortunately, the Save the Bay bill won and was signed by then Governor Reagan. BCDC's charge basically was to regulate bay fill in accordance with the McAteer-Petras Act Bay Plan and to promote public access. Well, how did 3 East Bay housewives with no prior environmental training or experience accomplish this? I would say with a lot of luck, a lot of help, and of course with determination, persistence, and yes, a lot of hard work. This included learning as much as possible about the issues and presenting factually correct information. The luck and the help often went together. For example, having the leadership and guidance of Bill Mott and Will Seary, of having the strong support of Gene McClure and Nick Petras, of knowing university administrators such as Eugene Lee of the Institute of Governmental Studies, who arranged for Mel Scott to write his influential monograph, The Future of San Francisco Bay. This became really sort of a Bible for Senator McAteer. And professors such as Fred Balderston of the Business School, who would write or speak at hearings, which gave credibility to our cause. We were lucky to attract dedicated supporters and volunteers from the 9 Bay counties and from statewide legislative districts. We were lucky to have very helpful legal expertise of several Bay Area lawyers. We were exceedingly lucky to have some friendly and competent legislators and Supreme Court justices, both very important. Before use of the term outreach, Save the Bay made common cause with many diverse groups, particularly when seeking legislative support. So we were very lucky to have a wide variety of outstanding allies, including professional organizations, a network of other environmental organizations, and many dedicated individuals. One such was Clark Bicey, then president of the Bank of America, who, when speaking in 1964 to the San Mateo Development Association, said, quote, "In my view, our most pressing problem is the need to determine now how we are going to utilize and preserve the one great asset that we cannot replace, the physical attributes of the area. We have to make decisions now on what attributes we want this area to have in the future. To do this, we must determine our values. Once we decide on our values, then we must find the means to preserve or attain them." This citizen effort to save San Francisco Bay must have been considered, quote, good copy. Again, we were lucky to have an amazing amount of local, regional, and national unsolicited press, periodical, and radio coverage. For many of us, our effort to save the Bay was a rich learning experience. But as Craig Kerr once said, when we started out, we thought all we had to do was to get a good law and the Bay would be saved. What we have learned is that the Bay is never saved. It is instead always in the process of being saved. We therefore now find it very gratifying that there are many more groups and individuals continuing this process and working for the health and well-being of the Bay, its shoreline and watersheds, and for the natural and human systems it sustains. One might say the beginnings of the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s were built on the earlier foresight of the then conservationists, such as Newton Drury, Zephyr Evers, Caroline Livermore, Dorothy Erskine, Ed and Peggy Wayburn, Dick Leonard, David Brower, and others. During the same period in the 60s and early 70s, aside from the threat to the Bay, there were numerous environmentally destructive proposals. These included the PG&E nuclear power plant at Bodega Head, a highway through the Golden Gate Park Panhandle, the Embarcadero Freeway, which finally came down, a straight realignment of Highway 101 through a stand of old-growth redwoods, a causeway road across Emerald Bay at Lake Tahoe, and the large Marinchello development planned for the Marin Hills back of Sausalito. In each case, citizen activists formed advocacy groups, and all these proposals were defeated. However, about the same time, attitudes were beginning to change. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson, probably encouraged by Lady Bird and Lawrence Rockefeller, held a White House conference on natural beauty. And the following year, Governor Reagan convened a similar conference. All over the country, perhaps influenced by Earth Day, cities began to regard their bay, river, lake, and ocean fronts as assets, and their surrounding landscape as areas to be cherished and preserved. Recently, some have asked, is environmentalism dead? I would say absolutely not. Except for current top administrative decision makers, it seems to me environmentalism is alive, well, and getting stronger. In fact, some environmental issues are going mainstream, with city governments and corporations espousing use of solar and wind technologies. Religions, such as Interfaith Power and Light, are promoting energy-saving methods. The building industry now has green standards. And citizen activists are recommending more green spaces, roof gardens, and street trees. Dirty air and toxic waste have become public health issues. For the past 30 years, the Environmental Careers Organization and the Student Conservation Association have been matching student interns and volunteers to government agencies, businesses, nonprofits, and the national parks, forests, and BLM lands. They have reached out to the broader populations of color, and the issues now include environmental justice and quality of life. Many volunteer citizen activist groups are now helping wherever needed. The GGNRA Conservancy has over 1,000 volunteers. San Francisco's Neighborhood Parks Council has 129 participating neighborhood parks groups, and nearly every creek in the Bay Area has its Friends of the Creek group. Trout and salmon are now rediscovering some of these creeks. Who knows, maybe someday they'll find their way up Strawberry Creek. Nearly every middle and high school has an ecology club. The university has an increasing number of multidisciplinary environmental courses. In the aforementioned early period, there were many environmental heroes, and I hope their achievements are all archived at the Bancroft. Our natural environment, like the Bay, is always in the process of being saved, enhanced, and restored. We certainly hope that current and future generations of environmentally educated and motivated students will be the voters, the citizen activists, and the environmental heroes of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I must say I was very pleased when Charles Paul Haver asked me to speak on the occasion of Bancroft Library's Centennial celebration. And I was particularly pleased when I learned that I would do so on a panel with Anne Lage, because as she has already noted, we have known each other since the 70s. We were mere children then, and we were working in the Sierra Club's History Committee and also with the Oral History Office under Willa Baum, who many of you doubtless know. The occasion of the Centennial and my own long-standing interest in environmental history has prompted me today to talk about the convergence of what I want to call the environmental project and the historical project. What do I mean by the historical project? Certainly, I refer to the disciplined processes whereby many of us collect, preserve, authenticate, and analyze evidence of the past. Most of us undertake these endeavors for the sheer joy of knowing, for the pleasure of learning and telling stories. And I am proud that the narrative form continues to not dominate historical writing. Historians are, as those of you who have sat through yesterday and today have doubtless become aware, we are storytellers. The environmental project is similarly characterized by joy, the joy of experiencing the natural world, of knowing its past and its present, of delighting in seeing it, feeling it, hearing it, and in the ways that it makes us feel. But both of these projects go beyond romancing. Participants look at the past, human and natural, to understand the present, so that we might know how we came to this moment and to this place. I occasionally ponder what it is visitors unacquainted with American history see when they visit Yosemite National Park. I see the Wananichi collecting acorns. I see John Muir sauntering through the valley and Clarence King measuring the elevations of its surrounding peaks. I feel the geographical forces or the geological forces that push up and wear down the granite walls. And I hear the native legend of how Half Dome was formed by a bolt of lightning that rent it asunder. By seeing Yosemite this way, I understand the present, why the trails run where they do, why the place names, why the crowds come, even the character of the vegetation and the steepness of the surrounding cliffs. But once we see the present through the lens of the past, can we look into the future? Historians are far too wise to predict. Even natural scientists who wrestle with the vagaries of chaos theory in studying biological evolution see complexity that make telling the future no easy task. Yet one hopes both groups can gingerly advise, if only to be on the safe side. The proclivity to conflate the environmental and the historical projects may seem modern, but the association is long-standing. My mind goes back to the Virginia gentleman, William Byrd, who had two passions in life: to record the history of English settlement in America and the natural history of Virginia. Byrd eagerly explored Virginia's backcountry in 1728. Thrilled by what he called this desolate wilderness and identifying its strange plants and animals within the European Linnaeus taxonomy. During the course of Byrd's life, he built a library of 3,600 items and acquired 178,000 acres of Virginia. He located the city of Richmond on his 178,000 acres, so we cannot call him a precursor of the modern environmentalist. Yet we can say his enthusiasm make him one of the forefathers of two of our modern loves, wildness and libraries. In the case of the painter, George Catlin, the line between natural and human history was seamless. Catlin recorded detailed images of the Western Plains and the faces of Native American Iowan people in 1836, the year before smallpox ravaged their faces and their lives, and not long before the bison and the buffalo grasses would disappear from the watersheds of the Missouri River. Catlin advocated that the United States establish a vast national park to protect these people and to protect a portion of the plains. Byrd's and Catlin's interests were shared by many of their contemporaries and those who would follow, like Thomas Jefferson, giving Americans a long tradition of love for wild places, even while on occasion we have desecrated them. So intertwined are the historical and the environmental projects that we cannot understand one without the other. The physical world is an actor in the human drama, opening doors and closing doors, directing and diverting the flow of humanity, just as humans divert and direct the flow of rivers. In my mind, it is by no casual coincidence that the lives and work of the English naturalist Charles Darwin and the New Englander, who was a diplomat for the United States, representing the United States in Italy, George Perkins Marsh, overlapped, and their writings bore complementary messages. Both men died in their 70s in 1882, and both published their great works within a 5-year period. Darwin in 1859 and Marsh in 1864. In the 1850s and 1860s, Europeans and North Americans witnessed industrial changes so rapid that we today call them a revolution. This was a moment in time in which time itself seemed to become so accelerated and so carefully delineated as to be qualitatively altered, permitting a new acuity in our visions of natural and human history. Darwin titled his work On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or, subtitle, Preserving the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. George Perkins Marsh's book was named Man and Nature, or Physical Environment as Modified by Human Action. In a strikingly modern vein, Marsh had considered calling his work Man, the Disturber of Nature's Harmonies. Marsh was not only, like Darwin, a great naturalist and a traveler, but he was also one of the founders of the Smithsonian Institution. His book, Man and Nature, described how mankind had dramatically altered landscapes from the Mediterranean to New England, transforming, in some cases, lands once heavily forested into deserts, semi-arid lands into arid lands. Darwin told us that the very way in which we look, the way we live, in short, who we are, has been determined by the action of the natural world, building on our ability to survive and to reproduce, picking and choosing among randomly presented traits. The convergence of the environmental and the historical projects characterized as well the quickening of developments that occurred at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, those years that historians commonly refer to as the progressive period. Reforms were enacted in response to a growing sense of new possibilities and new limits in America. Among the educational reforms of that period was the founding of Bancroft Library itself. But I am reminded as well of the establishment of the Sierra Club across the bay a few years earlier, and the acceleration of efforts to establish national parks and national forests. Under the editorship of William Bidet, and later Berkeley's Francis Farquhar, the Sierra Club Bulletin for decades moved without misstep between presenting natural history essays, stories about the exploration of the West, detailed narratives of mountain climbs, the process of place naming, and pleas to conserve the Sierra. The ways in which I see Western culture's simultaneous cultivation of an environmental and a historical awareness help me understand a phenomena that has often amazed me, and that is the transparency of the modern environmental movement. Environmentalists have proved not just willing to permit scholarly examination of their work, they have cultivated such examination. Volunteer activists, professionals in the field, the movement's own organizations have all amassed vast archival collections across the country. To name a few, there are the Save the Redwoods League's and the Sierra Club's collections in Bancroft, the Wilderness Society's papers in the Denver Public Library, and the records of the Cascades Conservation Committee at the University of Washington. Literally several hundred, you said 250, and environmentalists have been interviewed by Bancroft's Oral History Office alone. Why, I ask, has there been such a transparency, even an eagerness to embrace the historical project? It is not an urge necessarily shared by commercial corporations or non-governmental organizations, or even by public agencies, which today often and unfortunately assiduously shred their records for fear of lawsuits. Are environmentalists unacquainted with lawsuits? Certainly not. Are they naive? Surely no. Did I get a resounding no from the front? They have fought many battles, and they have often, and unfortunately, even fought among themselves. David Brower, the executive director of the Sierra Club in the 1960s and the founder in the 1970s of Friends of the Earth, commented once in an interview that I did under the auspices of Bancroft, that in the modern world, one must be either paranoid or naive. And he added, I am not naive. Certainly environmentalists have been aware that their views are not always popular, and reprisals are not unknown. I learned this when I was sent by the board of directors of the Save the Redwoods League to interview people living in California's North Coast during the controversy over whether Congress should establish a Redwood National Park, which they did in 1968. One woman who agreed to meet with me, a sitting judge presiding in Eureka, spoke into my tape recorder in private and in hushed tones of her hopes for a park. She explained that people in the area who suspected how she felt and who would not want to see more old-growth redwoods go unlogged had sliced her tires or slashed her tires on 2 occasions. A few years later, I spoke with the president of a leading redwood lumber company. He was warm, receptive to my request to talk, inviting me into his home. But as I walked through his front door, his wife gracefully took my coat, my notepad, and my tape recorder and put them in the front hall closet. I would not be needing them, she explained. No archival record was generated that day, though I hasten to add that many lumber companies have, in fact, worked hard to preserve the history of their industry. But why has there been, I ask myself again, such a unique transparency in the environmental movement? Why have participants collected their own records so carefully, doing so under the auspices of Bancroft and similar institutions? Why have they permitted, even encouraged, the examination of even the most painful of their stories, such as the struggle within the Sierra Club that divided friends and longtime associates? I am certain that the answer lies in part in the fact that environmentalism in the United States has become what sociologists call a modern social movement. Modern social movements require a cultivation of public sympathies if they are to attract members and have political influence. Environmentalists use history, in part, to cultivate iconic battles and iconic figures. There are the images of successful campaigns that we all know, such as John Muir's struggle to save Yosemite National Park, a fight made almost mythic not only by Muir's own telling of his own story, but by Ansel Adams' photographs of Yosemite Valley. There are also the shadows, cultivated as well, of failures, from Muir's Hetch Hetchy Valley to David Brower's Glen Canyon, both valleys now underwater. These are moving stories. There are others, such as the young Muir being borne up on the flanks of the Sierra Nevada, having fled Wisconsin after being temporarily blinded in a machine shop accident, and saying to himself, if I cannot see, what will I miss the most? So he was determined to see the world. There is the story of the moment when Aldo Leopold developed his acute ecological conscience, the moment that he watched the mystery of wildness, or what he called the green fire, go out of the eyes of an old dying wolf, felled by Leopold's own shotgun blast. But I think there is far more to this association than the desire for persuasive memories. Just as historians have been aware of the role of the sea winds and currents in determining the course of human history, naturalists have seen how we have changed the earth. This is one story. When the Sierra Club's president and the president of the California Association of Certified Public Accountants, Francis Farquhar, built his own private library and published the journal of William Brewer and other Western explorers, when he championed the cause of conservation and honed the history of California, he was recognizing the implicit and integral relationship between the historical project and the environmental project. The result of such recognition has been, with Bancroft Library, a fine partnership between archivist, oral historian, environmentalist, and historian. And I have been proud to be part of that partnership.